and welcome to this election edition of Represent NYC. I'm L. Joy Williams, a national political strategist, and my co-hosts today are Brigid Bergin, political reporter from WNYC Radio, and Jeff Mays, political reporter from DNAInfo. Most of the country and the media is focused on the presidential race between Republican candidate Donald Trump and Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton. The second debate between the candidates is tonight, and we're going to talk about that later in the show, but first, we're going to take a look at the results of a few key state legislative races here in New York City, which were won by 3 women. So thank you very much, Brigid and Jeff, for joining me. So let's start downtown in Lower Manhattan, the 65th Assembly District. Now, this seat was held for decades by the former Speaker, Shelley Silver, and both of you covered this race, but Brigid, I want to start with you. What, in your view, is significant about this race?
Well, we're seeing someone who has been elected, Yulee New, the first Chinese American to hold this seat in a district that includes Chinatown and a growing constituency that is really becoming more politically active. And so she has the ability to represent them with a new voice. It will be interesting to see, how she's able to develop this position coming in as a freshman, knowing that this is a seat that had been held for so long by someone who had both incumbency and leadership. And because of both of those things, was able to bring a lot back to the district. So she's going to be starting from, obviously, step one, but she's not completely new to Albany. She was working for Assemblyman Ron Kim, so she's coming in with at least an understanding and familiarity of what she needs to do. It'll be interesting to see how effective she can be as someone who's starting out.
Now, Jeff, she won this race. Now, this is the second time she ran for this race because she lost initially in the special election against a candidate who was really the successor or sort of working with the former speaker, and then comes back and wins. So what significance does this have?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really the end of the Shelley Silver era. He had a grip on the politics down there for 40 years, was well respected in the communities that he represented. And so even in his corruption conviction, he was able to get one of his allies into the seat, but the power of incumbency this time was not enough to keep Alice Cancel in that seat. She came in 4th, I believe, and lost by a couple thousand votes, which is pretty significant because usually the power of incumbency is usually guarantees victory. So I think Yulee New represents that new rising politics down there. And as Brigid said, she's going to be the first Asian person to represent Chinatown, which is tremendous and shows the power, the upcoming power of that community.
But in that district, overall, because, we're talking about Chinatown being represented in that district, but it's a pretty wealthy district as well. And in addition, Cancel is still the district leader. So is that something she also has to be mindful of, running in this new leadership, sort of identifying someone to run against her for that?
Well, I mean, it's a pretty diverse district. Like, there's certainly, it includes Battery Park City and some of the waterfront where there is higher incomes, but, there are parts of Chinatown, parts of the Lower East Side where you're still talking about people who whose average income is a lot lower. And so, there's a lot of diversity. I think the question you raise about, sort of what her role is in the party down there going forward is a good one, and I think it sort of raises the bigger question of, well, what is the power of parties in New York in general now? And to what extent, we see in different parts of the city reform candidates rising and people who are challenging some of the sort of long-standing ways things are done. So I do think that she, is probably going to have that that threat facing her going forward. And we're going to see that across the city increasingly if people who want change engage.
Yeah, we should have a whole separate show on the power of the parties in the city. That's a whole different one in all of the boroughs.
But I do think it's interesting how many people ran in that race.
Yeah.
I mean, that in some ways was really exciting. I mean, you had Yuleen's campaign was very organized. She, since she had run before, they had some good infrastructure behind it, but there were other candidates who were really viable. The people who voted in that election actually had some really great people who could have represented them. And I think in many respects, given how cynical we can be about the state of politics and who's involved, that race, I thought, should be a sign of optimism, that there are people who want to be part of the process, who want to be representatives, and there were 6 of them who were putting themselves out there for this particular race because it was this open seat. And I think that's good.
I mean, and there were 4 Asian candidates, which I think is huge for that seat. And I also think going forward, New is going to have to try to consolidate her power, right? Because Cancel kind of made it clear in her concession speech that she wasn't going anywhere, that she was the district leader, and it sounds like she may try to come back again in a couple of years. So New is going to have to work quickly to try to bring home some of that bacon. That's what Shelley Silver was known for. Even when he was indicted, people in the district said, you know what, he was always here for us. He brought a lot to the district. He was very powerful, so he did deliver for the district.
Well, and that's the difficulty of having to run for re-election every 2 years, right? You win, and then you have about 3 months before you need to start prepping to run again. All right, let's head uptown, because there were some significant races uptown as well. And we have 2 new people in the Assembly, one in the Assembly and one in the Senate uptown as well. And this demonstrates at least the conversation in the press and in the community has been talked about, not only about the individual candidates, 2 Dominican women going to the legislature, but also the power of Espaillat. Jeff?
Yeah, I think this was a big victory for Adriano Espaillat, who won the primary for the 13th District congressional race. It was really a signal he's sending out to people that don't think about challenging me in 2 years because look how long my coattails are. So in his old seat, his old Senate seat, you had 2 very experienced candidates running. You had Robert Jackson, who used to represent the council in that area, so it's very well known. And then you had Michael Asher, who's a very well-known political operative, worked for Bloomberg, was able to attract lots of money to his campaign. So the fact that she was able to pull out a victory as being a relatively unknown in that political arena there shows how Espaillat was able to really drive his base of Dominicans and Latinos up there to pull out a victory. And the same thing with Carmen de la Rosa in the Assembly seat. She defeated an incumbent, which again is a huge deal. Guillermo Linares is well known up there, has also run for the congressional seat, and she beat him by over 1,000 votes, and is also a pretty relatively unknown entity up there. So in terms of her victory, it's very significant. I think for Espaillat, it means that he has set up a base of allies now moving forward. Now he's going to have to span out and see how he can include his reach across the district and different ethnicities as well.
Beyond the power of Espaillat and his coattails and winning the congressional race, there's also something to be said about, similar to Lower Manhattan and having the first Asian American represent an assembly district. Now we have 2 Dominican women adding to the state legislature as well, and sort of the power of reform as women.
Right. Dominican Americans are the largest immigrant group in New York City, and certainly there was momentum coming out of Espaillat's victory in the 13th congressional primary. The fact that he did run, this was the 3rd time he had mounted a challenge in that particular race, and so they were building some interest in running as the first Dominican American who would go to Congress. And outside of the strict political process and the candidates, the campaigns, there is some real organizing among the Dominican American community in that part of New York City to register voters and to do some civic engagement and education. And I think, some of these candidates are reaping the benefits of that, even though it's not necessarily for them personally. And so I think when you look at Marisol Alcantara and Carmen de la Rosa, 2 Dominican American women going to the state legislature, benefiting from the momentum of Espaillat. It's exciting for the community, and they are going to bring a perspective to the state legislature that's going to be different than the people who were in those seats before, than 2 men. I also think it's interesting when you think about the fact that Guillermo Linares was in that 13th congressional primary, and to what extent the support for Carmen de la Rosa, Chief of Staff for City Council Member Yadanis Rodriguez, a very close Espaillat ally. If this was some retribution for the challenge in that race, for the attempt to sort of potentially split the Latino vote in that congressional primary. Linares hadn't been in his seat as long, but it's interesting because you basically, I think that what that says is you can't just look at the demographics and make an assumption about how a race is going to go. That those alliances are really important, and the fact that Espaillat had made, he had also declared the Year of the Woman, and then when he endorsed Alcantara and Carmen de la Rosa, there was a lot of momentum behind both of them.
You know what I find interesting is some of those things that you mentioned, voter registration and consolidating power in order to win seats. I mean, those are the same tactics used by black voters when we were trying to expand political representation, not only in the city, but across the country. Yeah. But I find it very interesting that that expansion and consolidation not only just elected men, but also elected women, whereas for African Americans, it mainly elected men. And so across the country, it's not only here in Manhattan, but across the country and other parts of the state, and seeing reform and sort of new representation and seeing women hold those is certainly great, because we benefit greatly for women's elected leadership.
I mean, it's definitely a feather in the cap for Adriano Espaillat to say, not only did I bring more Dominicans, more Latinos into the state legislature, but they were women. Yeah. So definitely that wins him some extra points.
Yeah. So let's talk about these the new assembly elects and Senate elects. Actual politics, because there's some things to take note as we're going into a legislative session, and one is just looking at Alcantara, who's identified herself, or at least aligned herself, with the independent caucus in the state legislature, which has we know aligned themselves with the Republicans. How is that going to play, or is it going to have any significance? It certainly didn't have that much significance in the campaign, although people tried to use it against her during the campaign. But how is that going to play out going forward?
Well, I think it's going to be an issue for her because the conference has aligned itself with Republicans, very Democratic district up there. So how is she going to answer that call, when they call on her to vote on an issue that her community may not be in favor of? They spent very heavily on her. They spent well over $100,000, maybe even close to $200,000 on her campaign, and it was a big boost for her in a very tight race. So now the question is, how does she balance that? Now, she's a labor organizer, so she said, well, I'm going to stick to my labor roots. People in my district don't necessarily care about the IDC, but I'm not sure if it comes up for an issue like the DREAM Act or some fiscal issues, and this conference is voting with Republicans against possibly the interests of her district. That could present some problems for her and maybe make some points for challengers in the next 2 years.
Brigid, I want to go downtown, back downtown, to Yulee New and her alliances with Scott Stringer.
Yeah, it was one of the most interesting moments when I was at a candidate forum for this race. They were all asked who would support Mayor Bill de Blasio for re-election in 2017. The only person who said yes was Alice Cancel, and everyone else kind of hemmed hawed, except for Yulee New, who said she would support Scott Stringer and gave a very vocal plug for Scott Stringer. And of course, what we've been seeing as of late is kind of the sharpening of attacks between Comptroller Scott Stringer and Mayor de Blasio, on their vision of the economy, on minority and women-owned businesses. Stringer has not officially thrown his hat in the ring, but
he's certainly putting out feelers.
He is certainly putting out feelers, and it's interesting to see how this new crop of elected officials could be aligning themselves with different camps, making things exciting for us next year.
Yeah. we're going right from a presidential straight into
exactly.
our municipal elections. Well, later this evening, we get to experience the second presidential debate between our Republican nominee Donald Trump and the Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton. This is going to be a different format. This is a town hall format, so you're going to have questions from the audience, questions from social media. We can rehash the first debate and who the winner and who the clear winner was, and all of the blunders from there. But let's look forward to tonight. What does Hillary Clinton need to do this evening?
I think for Hillary, it's a matter of her continuing what she did in the first debate, which was to kind of remain calm, kind of rebuff those sort of attacks from Trump. And she just really kind of showed herself, I believe, she tried to show herself as being the more presidential candidate. So I think at one point Trump talked about NATO and our allies needing to pay us in order for the United States to come to their mutual defense. And Hillary Clinton's response was so classic. She was speaking as if she was already the president, and she assured Japan and other nations that we have mutual defense treaties with, that we will defend them. So I think that's what she's definitely going to need to continue to do, to continue to keep that poise that she did when Trump attacked her.
I mean, I think it's not the best format for her.
Yeah.
And for however people have evaluated the performance of Lester Holt moderating that debate, there was an important role that he played there. And I think the dynamic of having people in the audience ask some of those questions is, you're not going to be on the most consistent footing, because you're going to have a different style from every person who asks a question. And I think that's going to be potentially not as good for her, and potentially better for Trump. But she was just so, undeniably, head and shoulders more prepared, and was so much deeper on the policy that if, to the extent that they get into policy discussions again, then I think she'll be fine. And I think Trump potentially, similarly in that town hall format, depending on who's asking a question, has the potential for coming across, that sort of interrupting and, curt, rude behavior may come across even worse when it is a citizen as opposed to someone from the media. So that's a risk for him.
Do you see, Jeff, anything different that Trump needs to do besides actually preparing to participate
It'd be nice
with
to be prepared,
policy?
right?
Yeah.
Well, no, I think Brigid is right. I think this format plays much better to Trump's sort of freewheeling style. You saw that in the Republican debates. He was able to be more freewheeling and kind of talk off the top of his head, and that played very well. And that did not play very well in this debate with Hillary Clinton, where he seemed very ill-prepared. Seemed like at times he was incoherent almost, talking in non sequiturs. So I think they're gonna have to decide. One, he's gonna have to look better than he did in that first debate.
No sniffling, no.
No, yeah, right. He's going to have to be able to answer these questions in a coherent manner. He's going to have to stop the babbling. No more talking about Rosie O'Donnell and Howard Stern. Those sort of issues are going to have to go. But at the same time, I think they want to keep that sort of freewheeling style, because I think this debate format really lends itself to that. Who knows what kind of questions we're going to be getting from the audience, from the public. They're going to be more sort of partisan questions probably that will favor Trump or maybe even favor Clinton. But he is going to have to improve in his performance and, looking more presidential, at least, because he did not look presidential at all in the last debate.
Right. Well, let me ask this question, because we're asking you as journalists, strategists, others who do campaigns for a living, are asking for what specific policies, particularly from Trump's side. I mean, Hillary Clinton, got her book, which has all of her policy recommendations in it. But it doesn't seem that question, that doesn't bother Trump supporters. They're not waiting for him to release any policy or any detail or whatever. They're fine with what he's put out thus far. And most of his supporters are also fine with how his debate performance was. So is there anything that's going to move the needle for Trump supporters? In my view, there are Trump supporters. They're not going anywhere. They're not changing their minds, no matter what he says. I mean, he already has his famous quote where he can stand on Fifth Avenue, So are there going to be any changes from the supporters, or are we just talking about that small section of independent voters that we're looking to move?
Well, I think that he is going to have to win some more voters, and then other than his base of supporters, in order to win this election. So, I mean, I thought in our last election, if you were an undecided woman, if you were maybe an undecided sort of moderately educated voter, that performance did not help you bring you over to Trump's side at all.
Yeah, I think that, when you talk about supporters and how passionate they are about their candidate, if you were a lukewarm Clinton supporter, after that performance, your support was strengthened. If you were a lukewarm Trump supporter, I think it was probably harder to excuse some of the performance there. And as an independent, it's hard to imagine that it was persuasive enough to, win your support. So I think it is definitely key. It's the undecideds that are, that both of them are going after at this point. And I don't understand how a performance like that would persuade someone to support him. Not presidential, not reassuring.
So what I haven't heard a huge focus on during this presidential race is the historical significance of having Hillary Clinton, of having a woman as a Democratic nominee of a major party, the nominee of a major party, and also the historical significance of, if she wins, that she would be the first woman. Like it's almost like it's happenstance that we're supposed to just believe it on our own. Is this by design by the campaign to not press the issue so much, or it's just such a crazy election cycle that we've just forgotten about it?
Well, I think it depends on, if you are a Clinton supporter and, you are hearing from the campaign, I think they do talk about it more. The slogan, "I'm with her." I think one of their most effective campaign ads has been mirrors, and that's an ad that shows young women looking in a mirror, and then all of these different clips of Donald Trump and all of his comments about women. And so while the conversation may not be as much about the historical significance overtly, I think the fact, and certainly one of the most powerful moments in the past debate was when Clinton seized on some of Trump's comments about women, and certainly about a female beauty contestant, and really sort of played that back at him. I think she is trying to use that in a way that reminds other women that this is who is running for president. Is this person presidential? And also reminding women of what they encounter in their own lives, with men in the workplace, with men in, at home, and sort of showing that she is rising above this in some ways. So I guess I would say I think they do talk about it, and I think probably the closer we get to November, we'll hear more of it.
Well, certainly, I mean, one of the, in just even watching the first debate, when Trump made certain comments like, "I want you to be happy," or, or he's just so prepared, and sort of other things like that. It did make me think about my own life, or even the critique that she was so over-prepared, right? And it made me think about my own life, of how going into a room, going into a place, and knowing I was the most, qualified, I was the, over-prepared because I have to be, all of that, and that being seen as a negative, and And you're right, it's more of a subtle, like to women, it's just like, we live this every day. Right. But there's certainly a lot of sexism at play in this race overall.
Right. I mean, I think you would never hear anyone say a man was overprepared. You would say they were serious and studied, but never overprepared. And even Trump tried to hit her on that during the debate, saying, "Well, you've practiced so much." And well, this is the presidential debate. Yeah. You're going to be president. You want to practice. You want to be knowledgeable on the issues. But I think she really handled that well. She really snapped back at him on that issue, and I think she really rallied her women's base of supporters because they understand that, again, a man that would never be called over-prepared. Even the issue about Bill Clinton and his indiscretions. I'm not sure a man would be challenged about his wife's history as well. So she has to deal with an array of things that no male candidate would ever have to deal with.
Yeah, and it's certainly, like you said, a subtleness. And the question I more have is sort of this. I believe it is a campaign tactic to not be overtly, like we can win this, we can be the first, in sort of that kind of language, but more of a subtle of shining the light or showing the mirror to the rest of the country what women face on a daily basis, whether they be in their own homes, in their communities, and certainly at their jobs. And so being able to, turn the mirror around and show the world and show the country of what women have to face. And just the mere question of presidential, because when people think of presidential, they think of a man, right? Because that's all we've had. But the fact that she has to fight for that title to be attributed to her is something very interesting. So I want to thank my co-hosts, Brigid and Jeff, for joining me today. I'm L. Joy Williams. Thank you for watching this election edition of Represent NYC here on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Goodbye.